Hello, everybody. Yet again, on this very, very cold April day, we have another edition of Consciousness Hour. Really looking forward to this show, as we always do. All the shows are incredibly important and all our guests are incredibly important and very interesting. And today, Susan Demeter, I never quite pronounced that right. Is it Demeter or Demeter? Anybody
Demeter.
help? Go on.
Demeter.
Demeter, right. Demeter. So I do say it right. That's really good.
Yeah.
Really good. So Susan Demeter will be joining us from Italy, which seems to be similarly cold there. Now, the way we're going to be doing this today is going to be completely, totally informal. Susan has already been a guest on Consciousness Hour, and we spent a wonderful hour with her talking about her life and her experiences and everything else as well. And we felt like with many of our guests that we didn't have enough information and we really had not even scratched the surface. So today we're going to have a wonderful 2 hours chatting about matters esoteric, and we will go into quite some interesting areas. And indeed, one of the areas that Sarah, myself and Susan were discussing beforehand is our mutual love for the band The Doors and Jim Morrison. And I mentioned as we were discussing Jim Morrison, this wonderful book by a good friend of mine called James Hunt, called Into This House We're Born, which I will strongly advise if anybody's interested in getting some background information about Jim Morrison, this is the book to read. It's really quite extraordinary. And in terms of this book as well, if anybody checks out my my various sites, I discuss quite a few strange coincidences that took place in relation to that book as well. But what I'd like to do is to really start with discussing about Jim and the things we were discussing earlier on about Jim and his influences. So Susan, without further ado, would you like to fire away with your ideas about Jim, the Lizard King, and also explain the reason why we got talking about him in the first place? It was your t-shirt, wasn't it?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I was wearing I posted on Facebook today a old picture from when I was like 16, and I'm wearing my favorite band t-shirt, which was The Doors. And there's the classic Jim Morrison pose on it. And I guess it was a bit of a synchronicity for you to see I don't know. I think a lot of people just, they grew up loving The Doors. Obviously, Jim was long gone by the time I was a teenager, but I found that his poetry, his music, his style completely spoke to me. Obviously, he came out of an era where you get a lot of, very upbeat, love and light type hippie music, and The Doors were so dark, and they were exploring that darkness and that shadow side so well that they really resonated with me, and I guess other teenagers that were drawn to that, and I just love The Doors. I still listen to them all the time. And so I just came up in the Facebook memories, and I thought I would reshare that photo from that time period. I still feel that teenager. I don't, I know a lot more, but I still feel that girl that was just so enamored of Jim. I like to call him my first rock star boyfriend.
Because it's funny, isn't it? All inside, we're all probably the most important times in our lives. I think we never really grow up from probably being 18 or 19. And I remember the first time I came across The Doors was probably about 1972, maybe 1973. And I was, myself and my then girlfriend, Christine, we were hitching. And we got picked up by a group of guys in a van. And we sat in the back of the van, and I really loved my rock music, and I was aware of The Doors, but I'd not really gone into any great depth. I was very much into my Led Zeppelin and a lot of my progressive music as well. So The Doors hadn't really, and they were slightly older than me, not a great deal, but slightly. And Jim had died by then, so his music wasn't as immediate as it seemed to be. But they were playing this song, and it was the song The End. And it was the most extraordinary thing I'd ever heard. And I just thought, this is incredible piece of music. And it struck in my mind, and I asked the guys, who is this? And they said it's The Doors. And I realized that this was going to be a band that were going to really interest me. And I remember the line, the killer awoke before dawn. He put his shoes on and he walked down on the hall and walked into his father's room and said, "Father, I'm going to kill you." And I thought, wow, this is just so different. And funnily enough, as a nice aside story, my girlfriend at the time, Christine, obviously realized that I'd taken to this band to such an extent that my following birthday, she bought me a double album by the Doors called Weird Scenes Inside the Gold Mine. And I remember her writing on it. And she wrote to Tony, that's right, I must have been 21, that's right. She said, to Tony, from the idiot who suffered him moaning and groaning about getting old at 21. And you look back at it now and think, oh my God, and I thought I was old at 21. But Susan, you made this wonderful reference that you thought in terms of a linkage between that and a quite famous movie.
Yeah, well, actually, and this is where Weird Scenes Inside the Gold Mine come in. I think the first time I heard the Doors, I might have been 12, I think around there, 12 or 13. And my older cousin, I was over at her place, and she had a copy of Weird Scenes Inside the Gold Mine. And she put it on, and I was listening to it, and I was getting into the end, and I was like, this is really cool. And then it got to the part about the killer awaking before dawn and putting his boots on and walking down the hall and that. And it was in that time frame that my mother had this friend who was really into horror and such, and she had the book, The Amityville Horror. And I remember pilfering it from my mother's friend so I could read it. And I read the book, and it was shocking, of course, and it goes into the DeFeo murders. And then from that book becomes the Amityville Horror film. And I remember connecting the song The End and thinking, oh, well, this sounds a lot like the way the DeFeo murders in the Amityville Horror played out, where Ronald DeFeo literally went through the house with his gun, and he kills his sisters and his brothers and then he goes and kills his father, and so you know how the lyrics work themselves out. So I mean, I remember later on when I started getting into parapsychology and that, remembering that moment in time and thinking, hey, it was Jim maybe having some precognition, because that song predates those murders. But I thought maybe, was there some precognition going on there? Maybe, I don't know. It was just that strange thought from that really strange but wonderful piece of music. And then, of course, the really terrifying murders in that film, which was, very, very scary itself. I think it was the only horror film that maybe had an Oscar or did win an Oscar.
Because I remember there were certain questions, weren't there, about whether it had been exaggerated and made up in certain ways. And I heard recently, it was comparatively recently, I think, that the husband of the family that moved in died. So clearly it was an intriguing film. Now, to me, when I first heard The End, I think I was immediately associating the Manson murders and Helter Skelter. For no other reason that was at that time. And of course, the Manson murders really was the end of the hippie era, and the idea, and after the Altamont Festival, the Rolling Stones, and the murder of the guy in the front by the Hells Angels, clearly it was the end of the hippie dream. And my sort of micro generation were the people that came probably immediately after Woodstock. We were a little bit young for Woodstock, but we're very much late 60s, early 70s. And I think the Doors music was interesting, and particularly because Jim was quite fascinated by Nietzsche. He was quite interested by the eternal return, the eternal recurrence. And I recall that he made some incredible speech before a concert where he said, imagine that you're living in the movie of your life, and you're going to live your life over and over again. You better get it right this time, and of course he was applying literally the Nietzschean idea of the eternal return, which is that if you knew you were going to live your life in exactly the same way over and over again, and you knew that, you would make sure that you got it right this time, because you were going to have to live it over and over again. And again, Morrison's ideas there, I think, were quite intriguing, I think. So in terms of your own musical interest, in terms of your interest in the esoteric and everything, what kind of music shakes your tree? What is the kind of music you follow? We've discussed the Doors. Are there any other bands that you really enjoy, particularly after the musical thing? Because our last guest was Mary Fall, and we've got a few musicians as future guests. So it'd be interesting to just have a little bit of a chat about that. What shakes your tree?
Oh gosh, it really it depends on, you know, day to day, and there's just so many. Obviously, like I like a lot of electronica. I like to listen to Tangerine Dream and go on these musical trips. My husband's an electronic musician, so we do listen to a lot of electronica, a lot of Berlin School, chill out, ambient type music. I find it really relaxing and puts me in the mood to either, if I'm going to be doing something magical, or if I'm going to be writing or concentrating on the subjects that we love so much, or doing some art. That's the type of music I tend to listen to. But I have a really eclectic taste in music. I like ska. I like to, you know, when I'm cleaning the house, I do listen to a lot of ska music. And then I like rock and roll, like the 1970s, you know, rocking out to stuff. I can even listen to AC/DC. Pink Floyd. I like Pink Floyd a lot. So I have a really eclectic. I really just, I don't listen to country music. That's the only thing.
The one genre that no one likes apart from people that like country and western.
Oh well,
Yeah.
I love Americana. I'm heavily into Americana, which is really the thing. I presume I can't say this term, the thinking man's country and western, but you know, some of the new bands that have been coming up over recent years in terms of sort of roots rock America. You know, there's some really quite good stuff. But yeah, I mean, sort of eclectic is the term. Sarah, what about you in terms of you were discussing your interest in the Doors earlier on as well? Maybe we could just draw you in here.
I was just thinking that we've all had a different murder that we associated with the end, because I realised that my murder was the In Cold Blood book by Truman Capote. I always associated that murder with the end. Well, I think I actually got into the Doors because of the Val Kilmer film that came out when I was a hormonal teenager, and I just got really into Jim Morrison, mostly on an aesthetic level, and then deeply in a I love any music that has organs in it, and I love bands that are drum and organ led, so I'm into like psychedelic stuff. And my favorite bands are Bitchin' Bahas and Cave from Chicago, and I love Tangerine Dream as well. And I like 70s new age music like Yassos and Stephen Halpern, and I listen to mostly electronic music. I don't really like lyrics as much these days, although yesterday I was listening to Wise Blood, and I love Wise Blood.
Oh, Wise Blood, excellent book as well. If you've read, is it Cormac O'Connor? Cormac O'Connor, something like Wise Blood, amazing. But anyway, moving back, so we've gone a little bit off on a tangent, but what themes would you like to follow today, Susan? Because, you know, in terms of where do you want us to take the discussion? You were talking about the rituals you do and everything else as well. So maybe we could move on to that, maybe something like that.
Sure. I'm just going to mention in regards to music and lyrics in that, something that maybe people don't think about, but you have to be careful sometimes with the music you listen to when it comes to lyrics, because music does cast its own spell. And if you're taking in lots of lyrics and you're re-singing them and you're doing that and you're chanting along to these things, sometimes you don't know what spell you could be casting. So it's something I am aware of when I choose what I'm putting into the headphones and what I'm just allowing through. And that's, I think, another reason too why I also appreciate electronic music, because it allows you to do your own trip and you know, your own musical journey along with them, versus having specific lyrics that are now getting into your mind, right? So
I love
it's all about
classical music for that as well. Like I was really into classical music as a kid, and I used to be embarrassed when my mum would tell people, because she thought it was like, oh, my kid's really clever because she likes classical music, and I used to listen to it in bed at night. And I loved it because it took you on a trip in the same way that psychedelic and electronic music does. You really visualize the scenery that the composer was coming up with when they were making the piece. It's so transcendent, classical music. I love it.
And who were you listening to in terms of classical music then?
Oh, like everything. I just used to listen to classic FM. I never had records or anything. I just used to listen to the radio. But I really loved it, and I probably wouldn't even be as good as I wouldn't have been as, I was so good when I was a kid if ever they had classical music questions on University Challenge, but I wouldn't be that good anymore.
you're doing the person you need on the quiz team. Because it was interesting, Susan, the way you were talking about how music can really put you in a different state of mind. Before we started, I was discussing the album Ceremony by a band called Spooky Tooth, which were a kind of a roots blues band in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And they brought out what I consider to be probably one of the most extraordinary and disturbing albums ever made, which is called Ceremony. And they did it with a French avant-garde musician called Pierre Henry. And the music in that is quite terrifying, particularly on headphones, where they actually use the ambience of the music to pull you in. And the only other band I think that managed to do this, and probably both of you will remember this, the band Faust, who were a German rock band at that time. There was Faust and Amon Düül II, and there were various...
Goblin as well in the Suspiria soundtrack. It's really great.
Yeah, because horror
movies.
Yeah, because it's very much, isn't it? When you do a horror movie, your soundtrack is so important that you get it right in many ways. So in terms of moving to the whole role of music within the witchcraft tradition and everything else as well, can you tell us a little bit about that, Susan, in terms of your experiences of it?
Oh, sure. I mean, I do incorporate music into my magical acts. Most of my witch friends do. They're either singing or they are involved in music in some capacity. A couple of my friends are electronic musicians that are also practicing witches, or play the harp, or like music is very important. It's part of the theater of witchcraft, and it's what really it helps to activate the psi, if you want to consider psi magic. It's really what adds to that magical soup, so to speak. So yeah, and I do, like I said, in my own practice, I will incorporate music. I sing to the local spirits every morning here, because I find it makes me feel joyful, and I feel that my day goes better when I acknowledge the spirits and I do sing to them. So that's music, I think, is very important. I think for everybody, being in Italy, especially, it's a country that is, art and culture is part of daily life. So it helps me with my magic. Certainly.
So can you tell us a little bit about your magic then, what you do, and what in terms of your work that you do? Can you tell us, for as long as you want, just explain it to us.
As far as my spirituality, my spirituality is very pagan based, and because I'm such an eclectic person, I don't have one specific tradition that I follow, but I incorporate several traditions into my daily practice. But basically, I work with local spirits, and then I work around the moon cycles, and then what would be considered the holy wheel of the year, which is a reconstruction of the ancient Celtic calendar. So I observe those. That's my spiritual self, but I also include magical acts in my research into consciousness and with the work I'm doing with I want to call them UFOs, but I don't. UFO has that alien connotation, and I'm not 100% certain that what we're dealing with is alien. But in the ideas that we have talked about in the show before, recreating or creating a UFO with a sitting group, sort of like creating a tulpa, and based on the Owens work, so the Philip experiments. So that I can look at this as a pure science experiment. Depending upon the language I use, I could describe it to you that way, or if I use more magical terms, it's a magical act or a ritual. But basically what we have done in the past is various techniques, such as in the Philip experiment, where we create a scenario in a fictional sense, and see if that fictional storytelling between a group will have an outer effect in the outer world. So we talk about having a UFO experience in a specific place, and we start remembering it as if it was a real event, and to see if that will actually correlate with events in the outer world, if that makes sense to you. So that's one thing. Another thing we have done in a very complex setup was pull from a group of diverse people that were all creative people, but otherwise they were quite diverse, and set up an online group where we did a manifestation experiment with UFOs, where we had a set number of locations. I think there were 6 locations and their geo coordinates, and then a 7th location that was like a ringer. The original 6 were UFO hotspot places, or places where UFOs have been seen or considered very paranormal or spook-like type places around the world. And then another one that was not. And what we did is we got somebody who was a UFO experiencer who knew nothing about the experiment whatsoever to pick one of these locations without us knowing, including myself, because I took part in this, and then put that aside. And what we did is we gelled as a group by talking, by sharing our stories with each other, and by building a rapport through meditation. We would meditate at a specific time with each other, thinking about creating a light in the sky over a certain space. And after about, I would say, 9 months of doing this, we did seem to have confirmation of lights in Norway. And so at that point, I thought, okay, well, we'll put this experiment, we'll stop it, and we'll check to see which geo coords it was. And it happened to be in Norway. It happened to be in the exact same. So I thought there must be some, like, we had hoped to create like a spaceship, like a mothership type thing, but instead it was a series of lights. But apparently the most impressive set of lights that were seen in the last decade there. I know this because there was a Facebook post that was made by a person who's running Project Hestel, and they're telling us this, and saying that they were looking forward to checking their instrumentation, because they have scientific instruments there, to see if these lights or what they were seeing was caught. And they weren't, which I'm not surprised, because whenever you have anything truly magical, it doesn't seem to want to be observed that way or recorded that way. But it was still there. It was a confirmation from somebody there that they saw something. There was a witness that saw something, even if it wasn't caught out on instrumentation. And they certainly didn't know what we were doing. This was a private group. But I took that as some confirmation that something happened, that we were able to shift reality in some way and call forth this UFO, or create this UFO, like a tulpa in the sky, so to speak. So that's some of the ways that I've used magical thinking and ritual and ceremony to explore further my research topics.
Interesting. Can you explain? I know we discussed about it to a certain extent in the last interview, but just a little bit of the background to the Philip experiment, just so that if there's anybody new that's listening in here, just so they can understand exactly what took place at that time, because I know that you are very expert in that particular area. So just to describe it again so that people can catch up and remember what you were talking about there.
Okay, with the Philip experiments, well, I'll backtrack back to that wonderful era that we were talking about before, when I first discovered the doors, and I had this favorite used bookstore in Toronto that I like to troll for spooky books and paranormal books, and it was in that area that I first discovered a copy of the Philip experiment. Now, what the Philip experiment was, and the actual book is called Conjuring Philip. There was a group of people that parapsychologists that created the Toronto Society for Psychical Research, that operated in Toronto in the 1970s through the University of Toronto. main people that were running this were Dr. A.R.G. Owen, and his wife Iris. Dr. Owen was a mathematician, and he was very interested in parapsychology and in specific poltergeist activity. Now, they felt that this could be coming from our own subconscious, or, you know, our own minds, that we create these types of things, much as like the typical parapsychological model for what creates a poltergeist. It's somebody who, you know, can't express themselves properly. They're angst or stressed, and then all this PK and psi happens around them. So they figured that ghosts probably had a similar origin, or they were set out to prove that. And the way they did it is they got a group of people together from various different walks of life, and they had a scientific advisor and a psychiatric advisor, because what they wanted to do is make sure that the people that they had participating in their experiment were not suffering any serious psychiatric or psychological problem. They were also looking for people who were creative. Okay, so they got this group of people together. One of the screening things that they did, which I found was brilliant, is they got them each to pick out a children's book, a child's book, and pick out a character and act that character out. And what they were looking for is people that were creative and could be playful and would, you know, be able to harmonize in a group. So set out to prove that ghosts and poltergeists and stuff all stem from the mind, they had them set up a seance type room in the Owens house in Toronto, at a big round table, and they would bring these people in, and they started to construct a fake narrative of a ghost that they were going to try and contact in a seance. And I think initially they had hoped that they would create an actual manifestation of a ghost, an apparition of this person, who they named Philip. They even went so far as to sketch Philip, because one of the people in the sitting group was very artistic. So they sketched Philip and they talked about him, and they purposefully created a character that had a fake history, who's like, they put him in England at a specific time, and they had all these historical events that just didn't jibe. Historically, it couldn't be true. To say that, okay, if we have success contacting Philip, we know that he's coming from us, and this is not an actual entity that existed, because he'd be impossible. And so after about 8 months of trying different techniques, various seance, they would dim the lights, they would do all these things, they started getting raps, like poltergeist knocks. They would ask Philip questions. At one point, they started getting the table to levitate that they were on, like they were using for the seance, and they got very, very good at this. In fact, they were on television. They were on a television program in Toronto where they had people come in and show that as the table was levitating, that there was no trickery, no illusions. They brought this table and these sitters to the university in Ohio, where these physicists did tests on the sound, the actual sound of the raps, to try and figure out what was going on there, and to prove as well that they weren't produced, like these weren't parlor tricks that they were doing, that they were actually manifesting PK. And so from that, I was really excited by this. They tried different experiments as well with, there was one called Lilith, but Philip is the most famous one that they did. And I thought it was a really brilliant experiment. And so I always wanted to retry that. But as with the alien, because I'm from Cosmic Witch, from my book, I discuss how many of my experiences in life are UFO oriented. And so I wanted to recreate the Philip experiment, only redoing it in such a way that it would be a UFO, or initially I thought a gray alien, but then there was just landmines of ethical questions and trying to get a group of people around, and because gray aliens have been associated with really bad experiences. no matter how fake a narrative I thought of, well, he crashed and he needs our help, giving us a power position, or he's friendly and we're just going to help him, and then we're going to be able to send him on his way when there's just too many potentials to cause psychological harm. So I decided on trying to create a UFO in the sky. And as I said, with various experiments, I've had various success. But a lot of what I've done is not only based on the Owens, but as well on well-known occult truths and practices as well, to try and cook it up a little bit more. And I'm continuing on with these experiments to see where they go.
One of the things you touched upon there, which I was thinking, I need to know more about this, is when you mentioned in one of your books, about your own experiences with the overlap between what we would call the magical and the UFO areas. Can you give us a couple of examples of experiences you've had, or the things that made you think that this reality is not as it seems, which pointed you on the path that you're now on?
Well, I would say it really started in my childhood. I had a series of very strange experiences. The earliest ones to me seem more like a dream, where I was playing with a star child and we were speaking in some strange language, and we would go flying off together. And it was more, it almost has a dreamlike quality to it, the memory, to the point where I could say, okay, maybe it was an imaginary friend. But as I got a little bit older, past kindergarten age, where your memories really start to gel at that point, most people can remember back to the time when they're 7, 8 years old. And I started experiencing these little beings in broad daylight. They were solid looking, and I knew that they were impossible and they shouldn't be there, and they frightened me.
So what kind of circumstances did you see them then? Can you give me an example?
Well, the one that I recount in my book is my parents. My mother was pregnant at the time with my younger sister, and they were looking to expand, get a bigger home. So they were looking at this one house, which was a new build in Canada. So it's a brand new house. And they brought me along with the realtor in this case, in this instance. And I remember getting permission to go and because it was like a model home. There was not like other people's things there. It was brand new. But I was allowed to go and look around the house. And I remember going upstairs, and there was this really cool room with skylights. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, wow, this is going to be my room. I'm thinking my parents are going to buy this house. And I turned around to go back and go and tell them that I saw this really cool room with this slanted roof and skylights upstairs. And there was this little being. I call him a little man. It wasn't like he was weird looking, other than he was small and he just shouldn't be there. And he was staring at me rather sternly, and I was taken aback. And then my mother started calling for me, and she came to look for me. And she came into the room, and I could tell she couldn't see what I was seeing. And I was really, all of a sudden, I was scared and shocked. And I remember thinking at that point, I don't know if I want to live here anymore. And thankfully, in that case, that deal for that house fell through.
So this is intriguing, isn't it? So the being you saw, you describe him as a little man. Can you describe any more than that?
It wasn't like he looked weird. I did see a couple of like the boy that I remember going on these flights with. His skin was blue. I remember that, which was really odd. In this particular case, the little man could have been anybody. It could have been like you or I. He just looked normal to me, in a normal maybe suit, but he looked stern. And
so had he acknowledged you? Was he aware of you? You felt
yes.
Yes,
it wasn't like when you sometimes people describe seeing apparitions, and I have seen apparitions before that seem like they don't know, they're not aware of where they are at. Or this being seemed fully conscious. He seemed fully solid, And appeared to me, the vibe I got was this being, wasn't happy with me running around and was looking at me rather sternly. And I was so off put because I knew instinctively, even as a child, this shouldn't be happening. This being shouldn't be here in this reality, this space. And it frightened me. And after that, I had other experiences. I had an experience with one that had very dark jet black hair and was green. The skin was literally green looking. And that one really scared me.
So what was the circumstances of that one then?
In that one, I was going to bed. I was probably reading one of my Nancy Drew books or something like that. And I remember my parents, that one was very frightening. So I do remember my parents were not home. They were, I think, on a tour of Italy. They had been gone for 6 weeks or something. And I was staying with my grandmother. And I remember getting into bed and there was this man in the bed with me. Looking perfectly solid. And I remember closing my eyes and opening them and it was still there. And I remember being so frightened and going and telling my grandmother, I'm scared. Can I sleep with you tonight? And I slept with my grandmother that night. So I had numerous experiences like that, but that one was really dramatic because that one was very close to me. And I didn't touch him, but I feel maybe if I had, it might have felt solid to me because, and when I was little, I felt that these beings were ghosts. I think maybe because I didn't have a concept of aliens or anything else. I thought these are little ghosts. And I was scared of them. And then at some point in my childhood, I started having like this large wolf that would appear and would scare these little beings away. And I mean, it was a protector to me. It was this large.
So when you say the wolf scared the creatures away, did they show fear from the wolf, or was it when the wolf was around, the beings didn't manifest?
If the beings had manifested and the wolf appeared, they would disappear. They would go. So obviously, when I became in my late teens and in my early 20s, and I started getting interested in psychology, I thought to myself, okay, I was the wolf. Whatever these beings were, and at various times I tried to comfort myself with saying, this must have been all I'm a very imaginative, creative person. This must have all been in my imagination. But I came to the conclusion that the wolf was myself, that I manifested the wolf, that the wolf was a part of me. Maybe it was my daemon coming to protect me because I was a terrified little girl. I used to have on my bed, I used to have my little stuffed animals, like little guardians around me because I was so scared of these beings. And it wasn't something that, you can go and talk to your friends at school about because, it's not normal. It's not, something from our reality. So I think that having those experiences as a child, when I had a UFO experience at 23 with my brother-in-law, being an adult and being with another adult, and, and we were perfectly,
can you tell us about that then?
Yeah. So that experience, so I had at that point put aside my childhood experiences and I went on with my life and I thought, like I said, that the wolf, and I still do, I think the wolf was myself. I think it was a part of me that came out to protect me. When I was 23, I was watching an Elvira Mistress of the Dark movie. And it ended at about, because these things, they all these little details, they gel in your mind, right? Like you can't forget them. And I was watching this movie with my brother-in-law, and my husband at the time was asleep, and my sister was over and she was asleep as well. And so it was just the two of us late at night watching this film. And I had two children at this point. I had my children very young, and I had two little girls, and we lived on the 10th floor of a condominium building at that point, and it overlooked Lake Ontario and out towards the Pickering Nuclear Generating Station in Toronto. And I got up to go and make sure these sliding glass doors were locked, which was my habit. The movie was ending, and I saw this big, huge red light in the sky. It was octagon shaped. And at first thing I thought, is this somehow a reflection from the TV screen? And I looked back at Elvira's movie ending, and it's, no, this is something else. And it was November, and which is very cold in Toronto at the time, and I was in my pajamas, but I went out onto the balcony, my pajamas, looking at this thing, thinking, what is that? And you go through all these things in your mind, like, well, it's not a plane, it's not a helicopter, I'm not hearing anything, what is this? This is weird. And it's out over near the nuclear power station. And I started, when I realized, I don't know what this is, I called over to my brother-in-law. I said, you got to come out here. You got to see this thing. I don't know what this is I'm seeing. Can you tell me what I'm seeing? And he kind of grabbed me. We grabbed each other by the arms like this. And he said to me, I think we're seeing a UFO. I was, what? And it was around that point where this thing, which had been pulsing, to me looked like it imploded in on itself and shot up straight in the sky. And to him, he said it just shot up straight in the sky. And I remember looking down and seeing this lone car driving down the road from where we were at. And I was thinking, this person, this was huge. He must have seen this. Someone must have seen this. Well, this was 1990. So there was no internet. So we couldn't just go up onto the internet and get instant news then. So we just sat up all night talking about what it was that we saw. And, you know, I later told my husband about this news thing. I remember hearing you yelling, and I thought, no, you guys are probably yelling at the TV. You're watching Elvira, whatever, some horror movie. And so he always regretted not getting up and just looking out, you know, out the window or whatever. But we looked the next day. I considered, well, should I call somebody? But, you know, who do you call? You know, it's not like you can call police or anything. But it was so outside of my reality and anything I had thought about in the past that I began researching it. I wrote a letter to QFOS. I found a book in the library by Dr. Hynek, and it was about UFOs, and I wrote to him the experience, and I got the letter back.
What, you wrote to J. Allen Hynek then? You actually wrote to Hynek and got a response. Interesting. So what did he say?
Well, no, he had passed away at that point. This was in 1990, and so it came back undeliverable. And I was and then I kind of put it aside until later on, when children were a bit older, and then I began researching this topic in earnest for myself. But I think, and the way I describe it in my book is it was an initiation experience. And it was something that I think that the experiences with these little beings prepared me for as a child. And that is the idea that reality is not so cut and dried as we normally live in it. Our consensus reality, that there is a greater reality, and that is where these things seem to be coming from, or where we're experiencing these things is within that. So it was an initiation not only to my spirituality, because I feel it's strongly linked to that, hence Cosmic Witch, but also with my research interests into consciousness. Which is where I feel the answers to this may lie. If we ever do have any proper answer, I don't know if we ever will, but the ideas, the models, the things that I look at far more aligned in that domain of consciousness than in just these more simplistic interpretations, such as, you know, the aliens coming to visit us in ships.
I remember many years ago, there was a really good book I got hold of called The Rift in Space, which I think was written by French authors. And that to me always resonated because it gave the idea of this is far more complex and far more interesting than the nuts and bolts extraterrestrial phenomena idea model. You know, it seems to be, it's tied in with us in some way. It seems to work with us. And as you said, almost like the initiation. Now, running in parallel, were you running in parallel your interest in witchcraft at this stage, or did that come later?
Well, I was, like most teenage girls, I got involved with witchcraft. But I mean, my interest, like in astrology and tarot and all these things, that started developing as a teenager. But as I was doing my research and as I was setting up experimentation, because I'm a very hands-on type person, I like the idea of experimenting and seeing what data can come out from that. I started realizing that while I am couching these experiments in scientific terms, really, they're witchcraft, and I kind of knew that in my heart. But it took, I had a lunch date with this fellow, Dr. Adam Crabtree from the Esalen Institute in California.
Oh, Adam Crabtree, really? He's one of my intellectual heroes.
Yeah, I was so blessed. I was able to have lunch with him and talk about his experiences with.
He wrote Multiple Man. Was that one of his books, I think?
Yeah, and he had a series of synchronicities with the Bobby Kennedy assassination that were so fascinating. And I remember talking to him about all the things that I had been doing, these experiments with trying to invoke the phenomena and seeing if I could do something similar to Philip. And he said to me, he turned around and he looked at me and he said, 500 years ago, they'd be burning you at the stake. You realize you're doing witchcraft. And I was like, oh, yeah, okay. And then at that point, I was comfortable with saying, okay, well, if Adam Crabtree can say I'm a witch, then I can be public about it. Before that, I was more a little hidden. Like when I worked for this company, we were doing marketing materials for the financial institutions and insurance industry. Those are very conservative type industries to be working for, even in a creative capacity. I was fine with telling people, I'm interested in UFOs, because with UFOs and parapsychology, you can use scientific verbiage and language to make it respectable. But you come out and say you're a witch, people will, there's misconceptions. People think that you're a practicing Satanist, which is, I have no problem with Satanism, but I'm just saying that other people do, and that this can, really have problems in the workforce. And it's the same thing with witchcraft. People, oh, you think you're a witch, but I mean, after that luncheon with Adam Crabtree, I was just, I'm going to just come right out and just put myself out there. Yes, I do. This is part of my spirituality, and I also incorporate it into my research efforts, into consciousness and these mysteries of life, mysteries of the universe. So
I think it's so important to take a broad enough, to not just categorize yourself as one thing or another, because these phenomena are really intriguing, and something that we really together, the answers may, if we work together. Sarah, have we got any? I noticed that we're getting quite a lot of interesting comments made in the chat room. So have we got any questions coming through already? I suspect we have. Your mic's not on.
Oh, is it not?
It is now. No, it's off again. Try again.
Is it on now?
It is, yeah.
I was just going to say, I'm sitting in my back room and there's no heating, so I've got my little heater on me and it's drying my eyeballs out as I'm sitting here. But yeah, there are some questions. Niall asks, it strikes me as very similar to Christian rapture concept. He was talking before about there seems to be a movement away from the idea of UFOs and the greys and more into this 5D direct contact with the mothership. And do you think this has parallels with the Christian rapture? And is this an aspect of our culture now in 2021, now that we've gone through this pandemic and we're looking for a way out somehow?
I do think that definitely it's a reflection of our times. We're going through this pandemic as a world, but I mean, even before that, the way that the UFOs would be experienced, I think were part of where we were at as a society, and that it does have repercussions for that. I did notice that, for instance, the prior to the Greys, you have other beings, and you have space brothers, and they have these wonderful messages of ecology and environment and things like that. In the early 2000s, you start seeing the jellyfish UFOs, which are very exotic and very strange. But you have to note that also in this time frame, people started becoming aware of all the plastic and the garbage floating around in our oceans, and this was in the news a lot, and people were hearing a lot about ecology in the ocean, and next thing you know, the UFOs in the sky are mirroring that. They're jellyfish. So you also, in the 90s, you have these horrifying aliens that are doing these, very strange science experiments, like from the dark ages, that, on people, and having these very negative experiences, and in relation to government. And now you're having people that are directly downloading. You don't really have the alien pilots so much anymore. They're downloading, but we're also in the computer age now.
Yeah, you also have that parallel with our media and film and art, like you were talking about the different types of aliens that we've seen, and we've had Gene Roddenberry's original vision of Star Trek, and then more sort of violent dystopian type of sci-fi movies these days. And I guess that the kinds of phenomena that people are seeing tend to parallel the kind of phenomena that you see presented in art and films as well.
But yeah, for sure. I mean, one thing that we have to remember as well with the media that we consume, particularly cinema, is that even if we know it's fictional, we experience it in our mind, in our brain, as a real event. So these things do have an influence. And I can't really speak too much to the Christian tradition because I'm not Christian, but I do know that with various UFO events, especially major UFO events, depending where they are, they do reflect different religious traditions, whether it's indigenous spiritual belief, like with the Min Min lights, and they feel that these are the ancestors, and they communicate with them as the ancestors. Or you have Fatima, which to me is an absolute UFO event, but it was experienced by, I think, 70,000 people. At the end, they experienced what they describe as a falling sun. That was viewed as an event that was triggered by the Blessed Mother Virgin Mary. So it does, how we experience it, and I think how it displays itself is very much colored by where we are at as a person and as a society as a whole.
So similar to near-death experiences as well, that it tends to, in most instances at least, correspond with that person's belief system or idea about an afterlife, especially if they have religious ideas already.
Yeah, I think that there are some basic motifs to the near-death experience that seem to be universal, like the seeing of a light or a tunnel of light. I think most people have that experience, but then the rest of it, whether or not we're being met by angels or our relatives, or that is colored, I think, by our own belief system and our own culture. At least I think so anyway.
Yeah, I think sociologically it's all quite interesting, isn't it? In that there is this overlap between religious cults and UFO cults. I think like the Raelians, for instance, in Italy and Switzerland. And of course, we have the examples of the very famous sociological work in the 1950s of When Prophecy Fails, which was a group of people in Marin County in California who were expecting aliens to communicate with them in some way. And there was, again, and I think the question, Mynal, was fascinating, the idea of the rapture, which of course is, being raptured up into the air and being taken somewhere else, which again, there's huge parallels here. And I'm totally on board with you about the whole idea of cultural tracking, the way in which the whole UFO phenomenon seems to reflect our anticipations of the world. Now, one could be cynical and turn around and say, well, that's how it would be, because if people were imagining these things, this is how they would manifest. But I think that's too simplistic. It's too simplistic because, to me, our expectations do not mean that they are that they are internal to ourselves. There's a far bigger relationship happening here. Don't you agree?
Well, yes, because I mean, I think the imagination is part of the equation, but it's not all internalized. Even if it is springing forth from our internal self, from our inner life, it is expressed in the outer way, in the classical physical world. They do affect physics. People report seeing UFOs casting a shadow. Well, there has to be some physicality to it if it's breaking light. People experience things like touch, or feeling like they're being touched, or they hear things. If you're hearing a sound of a disembodied voice telling you something, there's something vibrating the eardrum. Like there's some physicality there. So it's more than just people are imagining these things inside of themselves and experiencing them as an internal monologue or an internal vision, because they do cause effect in the outer world. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point, and a very good one, you know, and it does seem that there is this mixture of physicality out there, but at the same token, there is this feedback mechanism almost taking place. And of course, this is one of the areas that I'm particularly fascinated in as to what is happening here, because I've been interested in the UFO phenomenon since the mid 1960s, since reading, I think it was wonderful in my world, the way in which there are people that were my heroes when I was young, and then suddenly meeting them or being in contact with them. And one person was the late Brad Steiger, who I think in the mid 1960s wrote a book called Flying Saucers Are Hostile. And that book terrified me, and it really did. And I thought, whoa, this really is quite creepy, in the idea of it's not all nice and everything else as well. But there is more to it than this, and I'm sure there is. Sarah, is there any more interesting questions like that coming through?
Niall asked, what does Susan think of people like David Wilcock and Stephen Greer and what they proclaim?
Well, with Stephen Greer, I mean, honestly, and David Wilcock, I think that they are in part a business. And I do, you know, I question some of the ethics behind Stephen Greer in particular, but I have tried his methods. And
can you explain a little bit about who Stephen Greer is and what his methods are then?
Well, Stephen Greer is famous, as is David Wilcock, in the UFO world, as being experiencers. And then in the case of David Wilcock, certainly I would consider him like a UFO guru. And then there's Stephen Greer, who you know, has been taking people out and teaching them how to have contact with these beings. And I have very limited experience with David Wilcock. I have more with Stephen Greer. And I will say that although, you know, I have mixed feelings about him personally, I would say his methodology does work. Basically, if you want to have an experience, if you go out, if you go somewhere that is, especially somewhere that's well known already, that just helps a little bit more, and you go out and you open yourself up to it, and you get comfortable being on your own in the evening, outside, nature, and you go to one of these UFO spots, most people, I do believe, if you go out enough times, 5, 6, 7 times, you will have an experience. Something will happen. I don't know exactly why that is, but I have done his methods and they do work. They have worked for me. I have seen a UFO, well, not exactly, because when you're doing these things, magical, occult things, they never turn out exactly the way you want them to, but I have had experiences doing his methods. So I would have to say, on one hand, with these people, they're trickster-like people. They are liminal people within themselves, and I think the phenomena, whatever it is, favors these types of people.
That is a really intriguing comment, isn't it? That the phenomenon itself favors these people, because I don't know Stephen Greer at all. I've not come across his work. I am aware of David Wilcock, and the only thing that I know with great detail about David Wilcock is that he considers himself to be a reincarnation of Edgar Cayce. And I know he posted quite a few things on the web comparatively recently, pointing out just how much he looks like Edgar Cayce. And I'm thinking, well, this is moving away from being objective science and moving away from trying to interpret the phenomenon, and being into something more, as you say, almost creating a business around it. You know, and we know that all kinds of esoteric phenomena will always attract the people who feel it's a way of making a quick buck. And I don't know whether necessarily that's what those guys are after, or it could just be that as time has developed, this is how the route has gone with them. But I always worry about the involvement of people like that, because it tends to erode what we're trying to do, which is trying to understand objectively what is taking place here, because it's far more interesting than this. Probably one of the most interesting experiences people can have, and clearly you have experienced these things on a regular basis, and you're interested in them to try and understand, rather than having ways of generating large amounts of money and generating a business on it. So I can see both points of view, I think, in terms of that, you know, very much so. Right, okay, so Sarah, have we got any more questions, or should we move on with the general conversation?
I just popped out of the conversation, and I think it's Jim Morrison is our gremlin for this afternoon session. I just need to log back on, so maybe change the subject while I log back on Facebook and see what's happening now. Okay,
that's good. So in terms of how your career has developed as a writer then, so how did you then move on? You had the UFO experience, and how did things then pan out from there?
From the initial UFO experience, like I said, I began researching. I joined some communities. Specifically, I started going to MUFON events. At the time, for my particular chapter in MUFON, which was in Toronto, Canada area, I wasn't very satisfied. I didn't feel that they were speaking to my experience. And so I struck out on my own with a couple of girlfriends. We started investigating spook lights, and we would go out to this location in Ontario and we would try to photograph it. Eventually, we were able to resolve what the spook light was.
Tell us more. This sounds interesting. Tell us more.
Okay, well, the first time we went out there, and because I always loved mysteries, and because I had these experiences as a kid, so I guess it was in the late 1990s that, you know, a friend of mine had mentioned about this place in Ontario called Scugog Island, which actually it isn't really an island, it's a peninsula, and it's just northeast of Toronto, about 2.5 hours drive from there, on traditional Indigenous land. And there were a series of lights that people attributed to a motorcyclist that was apparently killed in a crossroads accident there, and would haunt as these lights. What you were apparently going up there and viewing was the apparition of his motorcycle headlamp as it, you know, kept driving down the road. So I thought, oh, this is really interesting. And I thought, well, why don't we go up there one Saturday evening, and see what this is all about. We went up there, and the first time we went up there, there was nobody. We were on our own, and it was snowy. It was in April, but it was snowing. It was around this time of year, many, many years ago in Toronto, in that area. And what we saw was a series of lights around a tree line that were blinking, a series of 3 lights, and they seemed to be rotating, almost like the classic flying saucer. And like at that point we were hooked. I was, what is that? And we began doing this as a hobby, researching this spook light, finding out the different interpretations of what it could be. And we started going up there. When it was nicer weather, other people would be on the road. They would be ghost hunting up there, going to see this spectacle. And we went up there, and eventually we tried an experiment with walkie-talkies, because of course this is the 90s, so not everybody had a mobile phone then. We were able to see that this light that people were seeing at a distance, we were able to triangulate it and figure out that it was a reflection of car headlights off this water and these hydro poles that was creating this appearance of one light that would be on this road. And you'd have to be at a specific point on this road. And this is what the main spook light was. But in our time there, we had many different strange psi-like experiences. And we never saw the what looked like the saucer on the tree line again. But that was quite an adventure. And I realized that what we were doing is literally making a pilgrimage, a paranormal pilgrimage to this place, in the hopes of having some strange experience or mysterious experience. And then, of course, being driven to try to resolve it, which we did in part, but not all. And just like with any of these places, places like crop circles, where there's obvious hoaxing, there's obviously somebody going and making the circle, but then people will go out there and they will have strange, inexplicable experiences with light balls and apparitions and all sorts of weird stuff that, is occurring in the crop circle that has nothing to do with the person who went out there and made it as a joke or a lark or whatever. It's the same thing with these places, that you can go out there and you might be able to, explain one aspect of this location, but otherwise all these other things that are happening, no. And again, I view this through the lenses of the trickster, that, the minute you think you know something is as it should be, or you have this mundane explanation, something else will erupt around it to say, oh, no, not quite so. So that is really what started it. So after that, and I gave my first presentation on that at a skeptics organization, believe it or not. I thought I'm going to go in and go right into the lion's den and say, hey, I did this and this is what I found. And the skeptics were all pretty receptive of it, because of course I debunked, with my friends, we debunked a part of this anyway. But I started going to skeptical meetings because I liked some of the skeptics, and many of them are magicians, and they were teaching me little magic tricks and things like this, and how to cold read and do all this other neat kind of stuff. And I actually was more comfortable at that point with them than I was with the ufologists or the UFO groups, until I had another UFO experience. This one was very close range with a friend of mine in 2001. And it was like, to me, it looked like a large diamond-shaped metallic object, very close to the nuclear power plant that I had seen the other one 11 years before. But this one definitely looked like a spaceship. And after that, and being with my friend and seeing this, and again, so I couldn't deny it. I couldn't say this is all just, I've hallucinated this, because there's another person here that's with me and is experiencing this with me. At that point, I couldn't maintain my own intellectual honesty and keep hanging about with the skeptics, because during my time with the skeptics, I started to question all these other experiences I had. Well, maybe because when you're with people with that kind of mindset, it's maybe they didn't really happen. Maybe I imagined everything. I did debunk something here, And then after that, that was like, I call it in my book, Cosmic Witch, my second initiation. And that brought me right hard back into this other realm of being, in this other realm of thinking, that no, there is so much more out there, and it is not explainable, at least by the methods we have now, or by a standard scientific method. It's not going to cut it. So from there, I just continued on with my research, and I did a lot of rethinking. At one point I was more enamored of the idea of aliens coming to visit us, until one day I really meditated on that, and I realized the reason I so want this is because I wish it to be so. I grew up with the moon landings. My father was a scientist. Every time they did a rocket launch, he was right on this. We went to observatories when we were kids. I wanted that, Star Wars, Star Trek type universe. And when I realized that it was my desire that was driving my ideas to what is the causation, it freed me to start thinking of UFOs in a much more complex and deep way, which is where I really think they're at, that it's tied in with consciousness, and that we may in fact be co-creating with a greater intelligence, or this may in fact be coming from a greater human consciousness, that I can't say. And when it comes to people like Greer and Wilcock and that, I do caution people that if someone says they absolutely 100% know what's going on beyond, say, describe, okay, I've had these experiences, I have an idea based on my own beliefs what they might be, but I can't say 100% certain I'm right. So when someone tries to convince you they have all the answers, that's when little alarm bells should ring off and say, okay.
I think.
Oh, sorry.
Go on, no, Sarah, please.
I was just you've reminded me of something that I was researching a while back. A lot of the phenomena you're talking about remind me of the kind of anomalies that you get in geomagnetic areas. And a lot of geomagnetic areas are associated with like ancient sites of power and this idea of, specific important sites. And some of the research I was doing about dreaming and consciousness during geomagnetic storms was quite interesting, because geomagnetic storms disrupt circadian rhythms. More people are admitted for mental breakdowns during geomagnetic storm periods and heart attacks. There's various ways that it affects the human system, but the magnetoreception in humans is kind of evidence in the existence of these cryptochrome proteins in the eyeball that are, I think they're non-visual blue light receptors, and they're the first part of the magnetoreception in humans, and they're present in like most vertebrates. But I wonder whether in the kind of experiences that you're talking about, perhaps there are geomagnetic areas where in that moment you're able to see with your magnetoreception this phenomena arise and somehow interact with it.
Well, sure. And I think this is in part the basis of with people that are ghost hunting, and they're looking at things such as geomagnetic storms and, solar activity, lunar activity, and then in these locations as well. I know that in Paul Devereaux's books, he explores like the Spirit Road and places where people are more likely to have these experiences, and in these ancient sites. And then when you look at the geological makeup of the land, then yeah, there might be a high instance of quartz, or there might be something with the piezoelectricity that is created that works with these plasmas that seem to be intelligent. This is some of the work that my husband does, and when he's researching Hessdalen in Norway and these plasma lights. It's a similar idea, and I do think that there is something to that. It's another reason why I think with the ghost hunting, people will, they check for electromagnetic disturbances. There is some correlation to that with hauntings and haunted houses and manifestations of ghostly activity. And I think all of these things are somehow, even if they're different things, they may be employing the same mechanism to manifest themselves, and therefore how we experience them.
I think that was a very good point, and one of the I'm quite fascinated by the work of Paul Devereaux, and I think his work is extremely important because he's trying to link these features. And I think the whole idea of, Sarah, the point you were making there about piezoelectricity and everything else as well, I think this is the route forward. I think this is, and to give credit where credit is due, David Wilcock in one of his books discusses about piezoelectricity and pineal sand in the pineal gland. So, he does do a lot of quite interesting work. It's just sometimes he then makes 2 and 2 equal 443, which is where the problem lies. And I think one of the points I was going to be making before is that I think that all three of us here are in agreement that there is a phenomenon taking place, but the danger is that people get too carried away with it, and as you say, they start to become gurus in their own right. And I again get worried, and I'm rather like you, Susan. I'm much more at ease, funnily enough, with the skeptics. And Sarah and I were discussing this before we went live, was about how, you need skeptics involved, because you could get easily carried away and get sucked into it so much. You start to believe what is inherent nonsense and arrant nonsense sometimes, because you desperately want to believe. And I think we have to keep, I know it's an old phrase, but it is so true. And it's the idea, that extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. And also, keep an open mind, but not to the extent that your brain falls out. And I get incredibly frustrated when I'm on Facebook and when I'm on various chat rooms and everything else as well, where people just believe the most illogical of things and can keep two completely illogical things in their brain, even though they contradict each other, because they want to believe. It's the old X-Files thing, isn't it? That I want to believe. But
it's emotions too. People become very emotionally, they can fall in love with the phenomena and with their own, and also with their own theories, and ideas, and they're not willing to look at from another side. And I think the minute that you've done that, you've closed the door on everything else. That's when you're on the wrong road, because this is so complex. I don't know if we're even capable as human beings to fully understand it or grasp what is happening. It's like, if the cat comes into my office here, she's going to see books, she's going to see things, it's just like I do, but she's not going to be able to comprehend what the book means or what it's for, other than she likes to sit on it when I'm reading it. But we could be in the same position if this is truly another intelligence that we are dealing with. So that's why I don't want to make a religion out of it either. And I think that's where some of these people fall. And that's why I'm saying, like, if someone says they know for certain, and then there's also trickster-like figures. It's the same thing with professional psychics. I find some of these really big names, like Sylvia Brown I'm sure she had psychic ability. Okay, I'm not going to take that away from her. But at the same point, when you're tasked to perform all the time, there is going to become a margin of theatrics and entertainment. And that sometimes even facilitates psi. Okay. Yes. But you have to be aware of these things, that some of these people, they are very much tricksters. Okay. So some of their information could be totally valid and very good, but some of the other, and you have to be able to discern this when looking at these personalities that are very big in these fields, in ufology or in the psychic world or whatever. There is going to be an amount of performance involved. So you have to be discerning when you look at the information being put out there.
Yes, I think sometimes people start to believe their own mythology, and they become almost the brand, and they can't equate themselves. They move away from being interested in trying to find answers to moving into aggrandizing themselves and saying, I'm somebody particularly special. And the danger is that because you get adulation and because people come to you and they want your advice. I find I get it to a degree in my, in my work. And I always bounce it back, and say, as Sarah knows, the idea is, I am not the Messiah. I'm a very naughty boy. And we're all seeking answers and trying to find them. And the danger is that people want answers. They want things to be nice and straightforward. And I get very frustrated, for instance, when logic goes out the window, like with spiritualism and people who supposedly talk to dead people and mediums. I've spent all my life interfacing with mediums since at least the mid-1970s. And I have yet to see one medium who's given me any information that has been of any use whatsoever. And I recall, for instance, there was one very famous medium I went to see way back in the mid-1970s. She was famous, and all my friends and associates were telling me, you've got to see this lady. She is the real deal. And we went to visit her, and it was extraordinary because one of my friends, Anne-Marie, she was the one that was telling me about it. And Anne-Marie comes in and she's talking to this woman. And immediately she's telling her lots of things and she's chattering away. And then they go into the session. And the medium then feeds back the things that Anne-Marie had told her in slightly different ways, and what Anne-Marie had told her in the initial meeting. And when we were leaving, Anne-Marie was going, she was saying, "Isn't that wonderful? How did she know this? How did she know that?" And I said, "Because you told her." And she didn't even remember that she told her these things. And this woman was regurgitating the things back. And then I sat down with her, and I didn't give her, you know, I know about cold reading, I know how this works. So I gave her no information at all. And she turned around and she said, "I'm seeing an elderly gentleman. It's your grandfather." Well, logical, you know, I have a grandfather. I was a guy in my mid-20s. And then she turned around, she said, "And yes, he spent all his life in London, never left London. My grandfather came from Liverpool and spent all of his life on Merseyside and never really left the Merseyside area." So that was completely wrong. You know, it was so wrong as to be embarrassing. But what tends to happen, isn't it? They throw enough information out there that you'll pick up on something, and then you'll grasp that, and then you'll feed back on that, and you'll be convinced that they came up with something extraordinary. Whereas 99 times out of 100, they were completely wrong, and nobody ever talks about that. And go on.
No, I'm sorry. Yeah, no, nobody talks about the amount of times that they can be wrong, versus, you know, some maybe brilliant insight. And that's what I was trying to say, is that nobody can be, you know, on all the time. So if this becomes a money-making industry for yourself and for others, then there is going to be the need to perform and potentially cold read. But what jumped into my mind was, have you ever heard of Joe Fisher? He was a author.
Yes, please tell us. I know about Joe Fisher and the Hungry Ghost, but if you can explain to everybody out there about the Hungry Ghost, because this was a classic example of exactly how mediumship can manipulate and how things can go wrong because people are desperate to believe. Please.
Yeah, okay, so Joe Fisher, he was initially from the UK, but he emigrated at a young age to Canada, where he really rose in the ranks as an investigative journalist in the 1970s, particularly on the crime beats. So in Toronto, he would cover things like the mafia and other like very well-known crimes, and he was winning awards at a very young age. He became very interested in New Age type movement and also in Buddhism. And I think it was in part because his parents apparently were fundamentalist Christians, and he was really dissatisfied from his childhood with that tradition. And so as a young man, and as many people were in the 70s, they were exploring the New Age and that. And he wrote a book on reincarnation, which the Dalai Lama actually wrote the foreword to. And he was totally into reincarnation. But he also got involved in mediumship. And the reason he got involved in mediumship was he figured that, you know, if reincarnation is true, which he really believed in, then mediumship might be a way to prove that reincarnation is true, because you know, you would be getting information from the medium, from the dead person, and they could, you know, maybe give him insights and information to prove reincarnation. So he started going to sittings and seances with a medium in Toronto, and she gave him a whole bunch of information, but in particularly about his soulmate. And the soulmate was apparently a Greek woman who decided not to reincarnate, but to stay with him as a sort of a guardian angel. And she described this woman, described the village they lived in. Apparently this was in the 17th century. He had died fighting the Turks, and she had died of a broken heart, but they had apparently reincarnated many times before that. As well, there was other people that came through entities, a man from the UK who had died in the Second World War, and there was very detailed descriptions about what unit he came from, where he died, his name, and all these types of things. So Joe kept going to these mediumship sessions. He was very, very impressed with the medium, and it almost became like an addiction for him. He ended up dissolving a relationship he had with a living woman in favor of having these channeled messages from this Greek woman. I think her name was, if I recall, Philippa. And he was so impressed with this, he decided he was going to write a book with the entity Philippa about their love story and about how reincarnation is true and mediumship is true. And at this time, he started appearing on television shows in Toronto because he was already well known for his reincarnation books. And he ended up on a show with a group of skeptics who naturally they were questioning everything. They were saying, well, this to me, this sounds like this, there's no proof for this sounds silly, whatever, And he was very emotionally invested in this story of this medium. And so he decided he was going to take the information and he was going to go to the UK because that was relatively newer, more modern history, and find this information and prove that this man that had been channeling through the medium existed. So he was able to find all this information out that jibed with what the medium was saying, except he couldn't find the man. Okay, so he couldn't find any proof that this man ever existed. But then he decided, okay, well, I'm going to go to Greece and I'm going to go to this town where, you know, my lost love was and where we lived. And so he got to Greece. And there was no village, there was no town. This woman never existed in any records, and he was heartbroken. Like, he literally, I guess, was embarrassed, felt he was taken in by the medium. He went back to Toronto, he had it out with her, and I can't believe this, you know, this is horrible. And he was literally heartbroken. Now, he didn't necessarily blame the medium. He blamed these, what he termed were hungry ghosts. So in his view, so he took the book that he was writing with Philippa, the entity, and threw that out in favor of a book that was very negative, that said that he didn't believe that what was being channeled was positive in any way, because of his own heartbreak. And he questioned whether any of this information was true. He figured that either it was some form of demonic entity, or that it was a disincarnate human being that hadn't moved off to wherever it is we're supposed to go as souls, and was trying to relive their life, in particularly their sexual life, through these mediums. And that the information they gave was complete lies and negativity. And that's really the basis of the book, Hungry Ghosts. And it really is a cautionary tale as to why we should be grounded. And even if we do get interesting insights and information through channeling or through our experiences with UFOs or ghosts or whatever type of psychic type phenomena, it's always good to be grounded into consensus reality and the rational, so to speak, world, lest we get too carried away. Joe Fisher committed suicide in a very, very tragic way that is still very murky. Some people feel he may have been murdered. He may have been possessed. After he wrote this book, his life really went downhill. He had gotten married in the interim, and his marriage fell apart. He was unable to get work. I met, actually, he's connected to the Philip experiments that we talked about earlier, because he was very good friends with Joel Wheaton, who was the psychiatrist and the one of the people who were supervising the Philip experiment, was a very good friend of Joe Fisher's. They were going to write a book together on purgatory, so to speak, in the I think it's Bardo in the Buddhism tradition, in the Dark Night of the Soul. But before that, they actually started working on that. Joe had gone out. He was living in an area, it's called the Elora Gorge area, just northwest of Toronto. and he went out to this area, and he apparently committed suicide by jumping off this cliff into this gorge. He was found by hikers in the river. The thing that's really weird about it is that police noted that where he was on the gorge, there were skid marks, like as if he had been dragged almost, and broken branches around that cliff area. So there is, although his death has been ruled a suicide, there are some people who do suspect that potentially it had been a murder, or that he had maybe even been possessed. He did talk about psychic attacks, manifestations of physical attacks on his body after writing the book Hungry Ghosts. And he felt, in his opinion, that it was related to these darker entities or negative entities that didn't want this information coming out. So you can take that as you will. Either way, it was very tragic. He was a brilliant mind, a very vivacious, apparently, person. People really loved him, but he was going down this route of channeling, and that without having, that grounding. I think he was really pulled in with tragic results. So that book is a classic book. I do recommend it to people. It's a good cautionary tale.
It is indeed. I mean, when I read it, I could really feel his disappointment, when he goes over to Greece and he finds no evidence, his absolute irritation of being conned. You can actually feel his feeling of why, what's happening here. And I was always suspicious of the role of the medium, because I suspected that because he was a good-looking guy, and clearly women liked him, and I just wonder whether the medium herself had got some form of fixation with him, and in many ways she almost manipulated the situation in some way as partly of her own anticipations. I don't necessarily question whether she believed what she could do, but self-evidently whatever she was channeling was not correct. And the same with the information about the guy in the UK. Again, there was no information there at all that supported in any shape or form what she'd said. And it's as he argues, and it could be the case, that there are entities out there that are like the UFO entities or whatever else we can talk about. There's a guy called Paul Eno that I've been on his show a few times, and I've mentioned a few times here. Paul's work in terms of entities that seem to be malevolent in one way or another and are manipulating us almost for a piece of fun. And it does seem that almost somebody was toying with him in some way. And I think linking the Philip experiment, I think, is the perfect example. I think coincidentally that they both occurred in the Toronto area and the area where you come from. But clearly there is something quite fascinating here going on. And I think it's evidence that the phenomena is far more interesting than just the simplistic idea of reincarnation happens, because as I've mentioned on many postings recently, there are inherent problems with reincarnation as a model. If you start looking at the science and you start looking at it, and the fact that different traditions have different ways of how long before you reincarnate between lives, there are more issues than there are anything else. But clearly, there is evidence that people can, when they are in these conditions, seem to tune into other lives that were real and were genuine. And this is the argument that there is some form of collective unconscious that we can manifest into, that we can tune into in some way, which gives us that information, which we then confuse as being evidence that we have lived other lives, when in point of fact, what we're doing is we're tuning into our DNA memory or whatever we want to think about. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that I think that there's a potential here for an Akashic record where all this information is stored and kept, and somehow perpetually kept without degradation, that perhaps mediums and sensitive people can recall, sometimes at will and sometimes accidentally. And this is where we get insights into these things. I have no hard and fast belief when it comes to reincarnation. I don't have any past life memories of my own. I used to think maybe I reincarnated backwards, from the future. And sometimes I like to joke that I think I reincarnated from a mermaid or a siren because I'm so called to the sea. And I have these wonderful flights of fantasies of being, you know, a selkie. But I don't have a hard and fast thought on that, other than I do see what you're saying, and I think the potential is that yes, somewhere perhaps this information is recorded somewhere in the ether, and it is either accidentally or willfully obtained, and then we can almost play it like a film reel in our own mind, and feel it like it's our life, even if it isn't.
Yeah, well, I wrote a book a few years ago with Irvin Laszlo called The Hidden The Immortal Mind, I think, something like that. And as you know, Irvin Laszlo has this idea of the Akashic field, which is synonymous with the 0 point field. And indeed, in my last book, I touched upon it. And in my new book, I'm really digging into the science and the science of the holographic nature of reality. And reality is an information field or an information field. And there's strong evidence to believe that this is the case, that you know, everything is information and we attune into information. And, you know, I know from my own weird experiences of precognition, my own experiences of seeing things within my mind's eye during hypnagogic imagery, that I know I'm seeing something that is actually out there, that is real. I just as a short aside, the very first time I had a hypnagogic experience, I was at work. I was looking at my computer screen, and I was doing some spreadsheeting and everything else. And then suddenly I wasn't. And suddenly I was, and it was extraordinary. I was looking down at an old man reading a newspaper, and I was in a tree looking down at an old man sitting on a bench. And then I looked up and I was in a square, a large square, and in the far side of the square was an ambulance going around with a siren sound. And I knew it was somewhere in Latin America, and I suspected it was Buenos Aires. And then it evaporated. And I remember thinking, what on earth was that? You know, where did that come from? Where did that download from? Clearly, I was a bird or something, and I was suddenly tuning into another consciousness that was non-human. And then a few days later, it happened again under the same circumstances. And this time I was looking up through a glass table. I was on the floor and I was looking through a glass table, and there was an elderly woman with grey hair putting a cup of tea down on the table, or a cup of coffee. And I was looking upwards, and I must have been a cat or a dog or something. Now, to me, those things were so real. And in fact, the memory of those two incidents are probably the biggest memories of my life to date, because I can still see it in my mind's eye. And you touched upon it, didn't you? And Sarah, would you like to come in here with your own experiences in these and your thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, I think that I was having a conversation recently about this kind of imaginal realm that you can find yourself in these altered states. And I think that when you are not in that kind of focused consciousness that you are in your everyday life, you slip out of that stream, and you're able to perhaps access that Akashic field and pick up on these things that are maybe happening elsewhere in the world through other perspectives. I was giving the example the other day, I can't remember who I was talking to now, but I was talking about the near-death experience and the experience of false awakenings in dreaming. And I was recalling when I was a kid, and my dad would wake me up in the morning to go to school, and I'd be really tired, so I didn't want to get out of bed. So I would dream myself getting out of bed. I had to climb down the ladder or climb onto my desk because I had a cabin bed, and get dressed, because I didn't want to put the physical energy into getting dressed. But I think a part of me was actually getting out, like an astral body somehow was going through the process of getting dressed, because it seemed so real. And it would happen over and over and over again, sometimes like every morning. And it made me think of those near-death experiences, because your body's experiencing often so much trauma and shock that your spirit just wants to escape that shock and get out of it. So it's a way of escaping the body and having that kind of an experience. I think there's like endless potential for consciousness in terms of what we can experience, where we can go and where we can travel. And you know, the cult of wakefulness and like caffeine orientated consciousness is a bit overestimated. We need the dark side, we need the kind of subtle, energetic, liminal states, as well as focusing on a laptop and a cup of coffee.
Yeah, it's a good point, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So Susan, what is your plans now? We're getting towards the end now. We're getting to the last 15 minutes or so. What are you involved in projects now? What kind of work are you doing now? Are you got any book projects on the line? What's shaking your tree at the moment?
I do actually have 2 book projects I'm working on. One is Cosmic Witch 2, which is going to focus more on the experimentation I've been doing in conjuring and manifesting UFO experience. And then the other one that I'm loosely working on is more in relation to ghosts and hauntings, and examining ghosts and hauntings through the lenses of a witch. What I do is I've taken some more famous cases, such as the Lady in Black of Cheltenham, and I have, as opposed to looking at her like a surviving dead person, I look at the rich symbolic content behind the experience itself. And I look at the experiencer, was a lady by the name of Rosina, who was experiencing this woman in black.
Can you tell us a little bit about where is this located? Whereabouts is it?
This was in Cheltenham,
okay.
in England. And it was at the turn of the last century, and basically a young medical student, a female medical student at the time, who was given the pseudonym Rosina, contacted the Society of Psychical Research, which was very new then, and was telling them about this apparitional experience that she was having with a woman in black. And so that became a very well documented, because there was numerous witnesses, and it was very well documented by the SPR at the time. And that's one of the cases that I examined, because there is so much rich symbolism in the idea of a woman that is completely in black. And I look at the person who is having the experiences, she was a young medical student at the time in what could be considered the first wave of feminism. Truly, there were women that were fighting for the right to vote then. And she was a young woman in a very non-traditional role, studying medicine to become a medical doctor. She literally was doing science experiments trying to capture this woman in black. And I make an argument for why the woman in black may in fact be a symbolic apparition for the women's place in time and feelings of this young woman versus apparition of a dead person. So that is it's going to be based a lot on my past work and looking at very famous cases of ghosts and hauntings, and seeing if I can look at them more through the lenses of the witch, looking at things as a waking dream, and the rich symbolism that can be found within these types of experiences. I'm not saying it's not a dead person, but I'm saying that there's a lot of symbolic content that I think needs to be explored, and to see what might come out from that. So there's 2 new book projects that I'm working on.
You know, I find what you're saying absolutely refreshing, and you know, it's wonderful to know that there are people out there that think like we do, that are really interested in trying to solve this problem. I find there are so many books out there that just reiterate the same things, don't they? You know, that books on ghosts, books on near-death experiences, and all they do is they just recount the cases. They never try to explain. They never try to move outside of what they believe it is. You know, in other words, what they're doing is they're writing the book to reinforce their own prejudices and their own belief systems. Whereas I think what is happening now, we've got a lot more younger researchers coming through. We've got a lot of young academics coming through at the moment who are really taking the approach to this in a much broader, much more exciting way. And I think we're fortunate to be living, in terms of parapsychology, in a very exciting period, aren't we? You know, and I just found it wonderful. And I mean, I'm really keen, Susan, when you bring this book out, because I'd be really keen to read it, because it's so important, and it's because of where you're coming from. You're coming from the role of an experiencer, somebody who's had these things happen to you, something that's coming from witchcraft and everything else as well, but taking a very, very healthy, objective approach to something that is, I think, is telling us something about the real universe, what is really going on. And I think your comments about the trickster are particularly good, you know, really, really good. And Niall Parkinson has just come up with a comment that I think is wonderful. Thanks again, Niall, and thanks for your involvement here. Technological modernity does not neutralize anything. It causes a certain form of demonic to re-emerge. Yeah, that's Jacques Derrida in The Gift of Death in 1996. And of course, yes, that's true. That is what is happening here. I use the term demonic, and I'm now using the term egregorial to argue that this reality is egregorial. Our brains are egregorial, and everything, it's like a feedback mechanism taking place. We are not in here. We're sort of part of the great out there. And sometimes we just attune into the great out there. And I'm finding now with my new book that the bits that are coming together, I'm getting so excited about. I'm jumping up and down around the room going, wow, that makes sense with that. And it's just great that people like you are doing the same kind of thing over there in Italy. You know, it's very inspiring, I think, you know, and these are black, dark days, but it's inspiring, isn't it? That we are all working together and we're all being brought together, you know, that we are in some weird way, our little group are being pulled together.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, Sarah, would you like to come in there with a wonderful statement as well, you know, of enthusiasm as I've just done?
I was just going to say, like, my main takeaway from this, Susan, is just how wise you are. And it's really lovely to talk to someone that isn't, like Anthony says, just kind of wrapped up in the phenomenon of the experience. You're really looking at the bigger picture and the wider meanings of the things that you've experienced, and you're really smart and thinking about all possible conclusions, just because that's true curiosity, isn't it? And I think that, like, as Anthony knows, I do this lecture club where I talk to lots of Egyptologists, and they could be very academic and they really don't want to be lumped in with the ancient alien crowd and things like this. And they get really annoyed with the ancient alien crowd of people, because especially when, like you say, Susan, there's money involved and there's fame, those people that make a living selling books, talking about aliens, building the pyramid and whatnot, they have to hold on to it, you know, like the Flat Earth Society or something. They don't want to let go because it's their identity. And you know, the Egyptologists have spent their whole career learning how to read hieroglyphs and trying to understand the ancient Egyptian people. But I'm sure there's some truth in a lot of what the ancient alien people do say, but those two parties can't come together for a more sort of holistic vision of ancient Egypt, because they can't be seen talking to each other, really. But I think that it's really wonderful, like you say, to be open-minded, but realistic and grounded in this world as well, because this is where we've got to get on with for the next however long.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you so much, both of you. Thank you. I feel so.
No, not at all. It's been fascinating and just really interesting. This is what we're trying to create here. This is the whole point of InCon. You know, it's bouncing out ideas, getting enthusiastic about things, making you think, wow, you know, there's an area I haven't thought of before. You know, we're here to find answers to the great mysteries. We're not here to aggrandize ourselves. This is not what it's all about. And I think today has been a really great example of that, of swapping ideas and debating ideas. And again, even though we've been going nearly 2 hours, and Sarah and I say this regularly, that every 2 hours we seem to go into this kind of time slip zone whereby you go, really, was that 2 hours? I thought we'd been talking for 10 minutes. And it's this wonderful egregore we're creating as a group. Now, very quickly, I am sure that there will be people out there who will be really interested to know more about your work and how they can contact you. Now, just to explain what will happen, this has gone out live, and then it will then remain on the Facebook wall for a day or two, and I will also upload it onto my own YouTube channel. as well, so it will be there permanently. So people will be watching it for the future as long as that channel exists. So Susan, if there's any areas that people can get in contact with you, any areas your research wants to take you, if people want to contact you, your website, your books and everything else, please, now's your opportunity to let the guys out there know about it.
Okay, well, my book is Cosmic Witch, which is available. You can order it through a local bookshop, Amazon. It's also available in Italiano as The Witch La Strega. And I have a website, Susan Demeter. So Susan, SUSAN, Demeter, DEMETER.com. That's my mothership. It's my online cupboard. Feel free to snoop. There's contact information there. I love to hear from people, especially people who have similar paths or research interests and experiences. I feel that we're all in this together, and that when we're sincerely looking, maybe we will never find an answer, but at least we can inspire each other, and who knows what might come out of that. I love talking to you. You get my brain going, Anthony and Sarah, I really love this. And thank you so much for having me here again. I'm gonna have so much to think about, tonight, and when I'm sipping some tea, some nice dream tea.
Yes, Sarah, tell us about your wonderful tea as an opportunity now towards the end, about this wonderful tea you've got.
Oh, well, Susan very kindly bought some dream tea off of my Etsy shop, and this one is a recipe inspired by Minoan herbal traditions, and it has the side effect in myself and a few of the people that have bought it off me have given you very romantic dreams, because it has 2 aphrodisiac herbs in it, Dittany of Crete and saffron. But it's the Minoans were a solar cult, and so it's a solar worshipping dream mix, really, and it just makes you feel really relaxed. It doesn't have a mugwort or anything like that, and it's just a really relaxing tea. But I think that having a ritual of making yourself a cup of herbal tea, I always have a bath before I go to bed, and those kind of things are really good for inspiring good dreams. But yeah, we've discovered that it gives you romantic dreams, which is nice.
The term romantic dream sounds absolutely wonderful, particularly in these lockdown days, and just the idea of having romantic dreams certainly shakes my tree. Okay, well, everybody.
Anthony.
Pardon? What did you say?
I'll send you some.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much. That would be really great. Okay. Thanks everybody for listening in. We'll put the links up as well. And as usual, just thanks for being part of all this. And if you can let your friends know, or your acquaintances or your groups that you're involved in, to let them know about this, because we really are trying to create a movement here. We don't have any ulterior motives. We're not trying to be gurus. We're not trying to be anything special. We're just ordinary people asking the really, really big questions. And as long as you guys are wanting to listen and watch, we'll continue to make the material come out. Okay, thanks very much, and we'll see you all soon. Okay, thank you. And thanks to Susan, and thank you as always to Sarah in the background there. Thanks very much. Cheers. Bye-bye.